Thank you once again for joining us for our exciting Food for Thought lecture series this spring. This is our second to last lecture in this particular series, so we look forward to seeing all of you again next week and then again in the fall. If you haven't already, please now take the time to silence your cell phones as not to disrupt our presentation today. We thank you, as always, for supporting this free community program, which is made possible in part by the M.S. Worthington Foundation. Today we have with us Bobby Frazier. Bobby was taught by his mother, Barbara, to draw and paint by age 12. And later joined her as a student of Philip Burnham Hicken in the 70s in his studio on Pine Street. Frazier started as a janitor for the AAN and joined as an artist in 1974. He shared a Little Gallery exhibition with his brother Douglas and held his first solo exhibition at the Little Gallery in September of 1976. Frazier was president of the AAN from August 1999 to August 2004 and worked as art director for the original Nantucket magazine. Bobby is currently the AAN Curator of Exhibitions, managing the permanent collection and overseeing the hanging of present-day exhibitions at the Joyce and Seward Johnson Gallery at 19 Washington Street. And today, he is going to give us a very exciting look inside the brand new major 2014 exhibition, Nantucket Cottage Style. So without further ado, everybody, please join me in welcoming Bobby Frazier.
Of course, if this were the 70s, or the 60s and 70s, we wouldn't be doing all this electronic stuff. But that's the age, the era on Nantucket, which was an era of vast change, in which this story is embedded. We created a bigger picture for this story called Nantucket Cottage Style, the bigger set of storylines, but it's really the seat of the exhibition is the life of Andy Oates and Bill Euler. So, how does an exhibition develop? That's essentially what I wanted to talk about today. Well, in 2012, we were contacted by the estate of Andy Oates, and it was explained to us that the NHA and the AAN would split the collection of art, artifacts, and artisan works 50-50. And during that time period, we had a tour of Andy's cottage in Mattock-Sham while they were doing inventory. And we got a good feel for what would be involved in the collection. And at that point, we weren't quite sure what we would do other than divide the collection. And so where does an exhibition start? This one started with actually moving the art. Some of it was from Key West and already packed, but moving the art out of the Oates-Euler Cottage in Mattock-Sham. Now, this is what the day should have looked like when we moved the art. This is what the day actually looked like when we moved the art. You can imagine, perhaps, a group of people numbly gathered around a small stove, blue lips, teeth chattering, you get the picture. But in this, the collaborative spirit between the two nonprofits was forged in mild adversity. Here's the box truck for the NHA. Yes, moved stuff in and out of that a couple times. Now, here's the ideal. This is a painting by John Austin of that cottage in Mattock-Sham. Lovely. And it still looks like that at the moment, which I'm happy to say. So the heart of the story belongs to Bill and Andy. That's Andy on the left and Bill on the right. This is in their house, their in-town house at 3 Bear Street. And I have a quote in the exhibition, which, by the way, will be open to everybody after this talk, upstairs, where Andy talks about when Bill and Andy first gathered here on Nantucket, they were a bit perplexed about the habit of Nantucketers to own a house in town and then perhaps a cottage out of town. But he said after it didn't take too long when they realized a cottage out of town was a very nice thing to have, where you could sort of get away from it, even though, of course, it was only 6-7 miles away. So the heart of the story is Bill and Andy. Bill had a head for business. He had a degree in hotel management and was an assistant manager at the Plaza Hotel in the Big Apple, where he met Mrs. Tutine, who owned the Woodbox Inn here in Nantucket. She invited him to come down and run the Woodbox with the cook, Andy Oates. Bill went on to manage, and I'll tell you why, the Jared Coffin House for a bit, and then his tenure of ownership at Nantucket Looms lasted 3 decades. Andy, this is a youngish picture of Andy, actually, attended RISD and then went on to Black Mountain College. And I can only imagine he went on to Black Mountain because you had a freer spirit, freer chance to do what you might want to follow in your artistic endeavors. And there, though he studied photography, he also studied weaving with the Bauhaus instructor Annie Albers, who's still recognized as the best-known American textile artist of the 20th century. And he was a photographer and had a store in Cambridge for a while. But though the story is really about Bill and Andy at its core, to create an exhibition, you have to create a larger envelope of storylines. A key storyline is, or involves, what I call a night to remember at the Woodbox Inn. The Beinecke family was down, eating at the Woodbox. He was here checking on what was essentially an early startup of a refurb of the Jared Coffin House, which was undertaken by the Nantucket Historical Trust, which he and his father kind of were the pilots of. And this is Walter Beinecke Jr. And at this dinner, apparently not only discussing what might be the economic future of Nantucket, was brought up that it would be great to have a weaving studio on Nantucket. And, well, of course, Andy must have piped up and said, well, I have experience in weaving, and gave his curriculum vitae on that. And, of course, the Beineckes, who were at that point friends with him, already knew that Bill had experience in the hotel business. So, lo and behold, Bill moved into becoming the manager of the Jared Coffin House, and Andy became the manager of a startup weaving studio at 16 Main Street called Nantucket Looms. Although I'm not completely sure exactly how the cloth company and the Nantucket Looms and the needlery were all welded together, whether one of them was an overarching corporate entity or name entity. It was certainly all the Nantucket Historical Trust at the time. So that was a fateful dinner that night. So the refurbishing of the Jared Coffin started. It was inside and outside. Of course, then it was called the Ocean House, or Ocean House. Here's an example of an overshot weaving that was done at the looms for the Jared Coffin. That was quite extensive. Textile was quite an extensive part of this refurb. Here from the NHA files, even though she's obviously half naked, was a photograph done for a magazine layout that was promoting the refurb of the Jared Coffin. There, I think you see needlework, but of course there was a whole lot of woven textile. At the same time, the downtown was being refurbed. Let's put it that way. Research is something you do a lot of when you're doing an exhibition. I tend to do far more than you need, and actually far, far more than you need. And I find that filling your head with all the facts and and elements that are involved in the history helps develop, perhaps slowly, the storylines that you need, rather than deciding the storylines ahead of time. This storyline involves, again, Mr. Barnaky, and I found an interesting and long interview with him on the University of Florida website, internet, very good. And he discussed in there the fact that people on Nantucket knew the change was going to come, and why not steer that change in a way that was appropriate. And so what happened here to the wharves and to a lot of the downtown, especially the wharves, of course, is they redid the wharves completely. And a lot of the buildings were falling down. Reggie Levine told me that, for instance, the two-story building on the right there at the end was, at times, leaky and unbearable when he had his art gallery on the top floor. Worried that at some point it might fall over. He might have been exaggerating then. And so the refurbishing of downtown had a purpose, though. And in this interview, he mentions, of course, that the main wharves, the three main wharves downtown, had essentially become not decaying, but old storage for lumberyard storage, paint buildings, and that they were blocking the beauty of the harbor. So those were taken out, and buildings were put in, and of course there was an expansion of the number of moorings you would have for boats coming into the harbor, which was a key to the transformation of downtown and the ramping up of tourism on Nantucket. Now, that isn't to say tourism doesn't exist in the past. Here we are in Sconset. Everybody played medicine ball, right? I mean, with your Jack Russell. There was tourism here. I mean, there were a lot of summer home people who wanted to preserve Nantucket in the old way. But there was tourism for people who came down for health reasons. And of course, there was the Sconset Actors Colony. But it wasn't a well-developed tourism. And Nantucket was a sleepy island. It didn't have a lot of business. Here's an interior of a cottage. This is around the 1890s, but essentially the cottages weren't all that much different in 1950. The old cottages that people rented if they came down for health reasons, etc., farmhouses or beachside cottages. And you'll see in here a mix, kind of a mishmash of different eras in the furniture, in the textiles. I don't think you can see too well, but the curtains on the rod are actually, I think, a form of overshot as well. You might know, Liz. They're kind of blown out by the photograph. And you might find at a dinner table antiques mixed with contemporary wear. It was that kind of way with cottages here on Nantucket. But as tourism brought in more people, and certainly artisans and artists came in on a huge wave with this, cottages began to be transformed. This is actually Bill and Andy's shack in Matacasham. Someone was just asking me where that was, and all I could say is if you keep turning right from Matacasham along that road that runs in front of, that runs in the division between the airport fence and the ocean, you will run into a series of houses, and this was at 40 Matacasham. Here, uninsulated still, but the studs, the wooden walls are all pickled white, and you see some of the style that Bill and Andy brought there that we have termed Nantucket Cottage Style. I'm ahead of myself. Cottage style isn't particularly a unique thing to what was developed by Bill and Andy and the Looms. Certainly there was a coastal living style, kind of like country living, but they put their own individual stamp on it. And you can see boat models, art. Now this is where are we here? 64? And this would be right after Bill and Andy kind of began to expand the looms or right about the time Bill and Andy decided to expand the looms beyond just a weaving studio and started bringing in gifts on a small scale. That's Andy on the left there. Do you know any of the other people in this picture? Right. And that would be Mary in the foreground on the right. So, and this is also a time period when the looms was through with their production for the Jared Coffin House, and we're beginning to create textiles for museums, corporations around the country. And of course, there's Nantucket Looms about 68, and this would be the year that Bill and Andy took over the looms officially with a quarterboard on the front. Hard to see what's in there. It looks a little empty. I remember it more with things hanging in the window like Christmas bells. Back to Bill and Andy's cottage. This is Nantucket style epitomized to me in a way, that sort of floor to ceiling hanging of artifacts, antiques. You'll see that goose upstairs that's up there in the rafters. And of course, if you're just cursory looking at that, you see those two photographs and one piece by George Murphy. You wonder why there's a gap there, but if you're standing in the building, there's a light switch, of course. So that's sort of the epitome of the cottage style. Part of cottage style involves fitting anything you can fit against the walls or in the walls. Here we have a John Austin painting of South Beach. See a model, of course. There were plenty of boat models there. Up over cabinetry, here's a Mark Sutherland piece. I'm not sure what the name is, but I call it Feather Vein. Now, when you get beyond kind of doing the research, gathering the materials, knowing really what you have to work with in the collection, both halves of the collection, you have to begin envisioning how you're going to display it. One part of what I wanted to display was a gallery style of the two-dimensional fine art, the paintings, the watercolors, etc. Wanted them to run pretty much straight on gallery style. And so we brought the extra movable walls besides the exterior walls of the upstairs gallery, as you'll see. I kind of wanted a dark, smoky purple, but Katrina came up with a lighter version of it, which I think is much better. Then the crew, which is Mark, Manny, and Andy, I had them build, which was essentially a 4-quadrant set of walls in the middle of the space, so that the space would be broken up. I could tell my set of storylines individually would kind of develop in each one of the 4 spaces. See that hole right in front of the stepladder? They convinced me to put a window in there, and it was a great idea. You'll see up there. It's really nice to have that not be totally solid walls. So they were part of, a strong part of what you'll see upstairs. These next 5 slides are going to be pieces from the collection. After all, it's about the collection ultimately. And this is a slipper chair by Billy Baldwin with material done at the looms. Not sure what that little white loop was over there on the right. That came with an ottoman as well. Billy Baldwin was, he didn't like to be called an interior designer. He liked to be called an interior decorator, and was one of the foremost interior decorators in New York during that 60s, 70s time period, and worked well with Bill and Andy, good friends. This is a piece by Keith McDaniel of essentially the doorway, one of the doorways at 3 Bear Street. And it, too, sort of epitomizes that cottage look. Keith McDaniel was an interesting person. He started out as a weaver at the looms, but Bill and Andy, in their mentoring, and they were mentors to many artisans and craftsmen on Nantucket, that could be their greatest legacy, actually. encouraged him to be a painter. And so he moved into painting and exhibited, in fact, exhibited annually at the Main Street Gallery, which was a gallery that opened in 1970 right across the bottom of Main Street from them. Essentially, if you looked across the horse trough from the looms, you would look straight at the original location of the Main Street Gallery. He died young. I think he was 37, but he has 3 paintings in the Sarah Roby collection of the Smithsonian. One of them is of the Steamboat Wharf. That was done in a more modern style he took up later, very clean and angular architectural style. Here again, an example of putting arts and crafts in any place you could in Nantucket Cottage Style. On the left is a pot by Piero Fenche, and on the right is a pot by Linda Darby Ballinger, who was Andy's niece, but who went on not only to weave for the looms, but that's a nice raku pot. You'll see that you'll see both of those in the exhibition. I'm not sure, that might be a Mark Sutherland model in the middle there. Over the bookshelf. And of course, Bill and Andy maybe didn't even need to prompt John Austin to do this portrait, because John was well known for doing portraits of houses and buildings on Nantucket for commission. But here's the looms during that time period. And of course, the car is definitely from that time period. And lastly, an art piece, Bobby Bouchon. And I think here he's using the cottage in the background really as a prop for painting Queen Anne's lace. Queen Anne's lace was an iconic flower in Nantucket art in the 60s and 70s, a little bit into the 80s. Now you see hydrangea, but back then it was always Queen Anne's lace, a beautiful flower. And I don't see it flowering as much as it used to, sad to say. So, in the 4 quadrants, I have the 4 storylines that these artifacts are in. The first quadrant is sort of the, well, it's the backstory quadrant. I have some, you kind of cut off the baskets on the left, the Windsor chair, but then and this is text-heavy quadrant too when you get up there. It helps tell the storyline, and there are some CPO shirts by Leah Marks. She did hundreds of them, didn't she? And also on the stand, which was from the original looms on Main Street, 16 Main Street, now they're back on Main Street, is an overshot bedspread that was woven for the Jared Coffin House project. You'll see a sample upstairs in blue. They didn't do them all just in red. So the first quadrant tells the backstory, the night to remember, the changeover of the Nantucket town into more of a tourist town, the beginnings of the cloth company / Nantucket looms. The second quadrant is meant to be, and there is a loom upstairs from the old quadrant front window, but not in this picture, is meant to, in a slight way at least, reproduce the store at that time period. This is an old pastry case that was in the looms. They would exhibit a lot of things in there, perhaps baskets, but most of the things that are in here are just collection items, not necessarily things that would have been in the case during that time period. And we have pieces that are all looms oriented, plus a 1970, and you can't see it too well, but to the right there is a 1977 staff photo, including the baby of Sam Caston. I think she's 1 or less in the picture. The third quadrant, my favorite quadrant, is the reproduction, yes, I suppose, of Bill and, in a way, of Bill and Andy's cottage in Matacasham, but attempting to give that, again, Nantucket Cottage style, art pieces, artifacts, shells, old bottles, kinds of things that you might have also on your windowsill. I don't know, I do. Kind of in that way of placing them out with style on 2x4s, windowsills, etc. It's changed a little. It won't look quite the same when you get up there. But that's sort of the real feel of the cottage style. And then the fourth quadrant, which will include all that back wall of the gallery, is presenting much of the fine art in the collection and crafts like pottery in more of a gallery style, clean, white, nothing to get in the way of that straightforward style. That allows us really to put as much of the collection that we have been a little hampered in putting in the earlier sections blast them in a large quantity. I think probably we're looking at a quarter of the combined collection that you'll see up here in the exhibit. Last but not least, right back here to the last pages, I've been skipping that. Carol said I could ad-lib this. I knew I could. I can't finish out with making a plug for the preservation of the Nantucket small cottage. Really, there aren't all that many clusters of the 50s, 60s, earlier small cottages left untouched on Nantucket. I recommend going out to Smith Point. That's a beautiful place for the old cottages. Hardly anything has changed there. Right down in the heart of Quidnet is the same. And of course, Codfish Park. You'll see cottages, including that Maddoxsham cottage, unchanged here and there, but those, I think, are the three places you're going to see real clusters of the old style, one-story, perhaps one-and-a-half-story cottages. This is the Emery Cottage in Nantucket, which has always been at risk to the weather, I think, up on stilts, and that was actually built in the 60s. And but still has that uninsulated charm. I've actually been in there when there was water flowing underneath the cottage from the beach. And this is Wapandongo, a family cottage for one of the NHA staff, who is our archivist of images. Ralph is here, she's here. Again, a beautiful untouched cottage from what I understand. I'm hoping for that tour, Ralph. Right down where everybody parks in the lower part of Quidnet. In fact, from the old photos that she showed me, it was virtually the only real livable cottage in Quidnet when it was erected. There were some fish cottages and other things, but now, some cottages are beginning to have their style fade. Here's an example. And some cottages have lost their style altogether. Just a little footnote, this is a recent picture because on the house that's somehow still there on the beach on the left out there, the white dot on the roof on the left is a snowy owl from this year's snowy owl. Carol and I were walking up the beach and we didn't notice it was there till we got into the zone of it, got worried and flew away. But we did get a picture in the distance. So. This is, of course, Smith Point. So. Any questions? Before I hope all of you will come up to view the exhibit. You get the sneak peek. Yes, Bill. Well, I did try to keep my pain in the butt way of doing things on the low key, but it has been an equal pleasure in return, getting to know the back stairs and the, yes?
Oh, I was going to say the first cottage we rented here was Duck Inn out at Smith's Point.
Duck Inn.
Could you hear that?
Yes,
yeah.
Duck Inn on Smith Point.
Duck Inn, and it belonged to Charlie Cahoon, who was a caretaker for my friend Jenny Pine in Wisconsin. And she called me up one day and said, I don't see why you don't come down here to Nantucket and rent my caretaker's fishing shack. And it was like she was speaking Greek. I didn't know anything about it. And we rented it for $125 a week. And it was, you know, you had the harbor on one side and the ocean on the other side, and you swept the floor and it went out the cracks between the boards in there. You went to Robinson's if you needed another frying pan or something. It was great. It was cottage.
Well, there still are, I mean, there's still Eelskin Inn, which is a cottage there. I don't know if people know. Yes, they're just really the way they were. When I first married Carol in the late 70s, we ended up living in the Linquist Cottage in Nantucket, which had a hand pump and a wood stove that ran out through a pane in the window in the back of the cottage. And certainly sand all over the floor, and though there was a bit of insulation here and there, the back bedroom had no insulation except books, which actually functioned pretty well. Any other questions? Yes?
Please, could you explain something about the paintings and the photos? Were they collected over 40 years or only during the 60s and 70s? And were they made by the fellow's friends only, or were some, you know, acquisitions of strangers' work?
To answer that, they were collected over a good period of time, decades. Bill and Andy were large patrons of the Main Street Gallery, which opened in 1970 and closed in 2000, which is just after the time that Bill died. So yes, some of that was work by strangers, but Bill and Andy were such mentors in the community to artisans and fine artists, and I make the distinction because in their store, as well as in their collective patterns, they put crafts on equal footing with arts, and you'll see some of that up there, although of course there's a lot of fine art. So many of them did actually become friends if they weren't already. So they were sort of large figures in the art community as collectors then, as well as people who mentored artisans and especially craftsmen here in Nantucket. Yes? Well, I wish I could explain that, but I believe it's a Scandinavian style of weaving which allows, well, you'll see it up there, allows you to do a pattern, and somewhere in the foot pedals and the heddles that you're, you know, it's a complicated, and why it's called overshot, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I think, thank you, Carol, who was a weaver before she became a lightship basket maker for the looms. But she's right. You know, instead of just an over-under pattern forever, you've got some of it coming up for over several sets of threads in your warp. And so, you know, they can create a pattern that way. And if you flip it over, you see the reverse of the pattern, of course. It's actually a piece of the full-sized, and it's huge, believe me, bedspread that's up here in the exhibition. Any other questions? You sure? Well, if you'll follow me up there, I'll certainly answer questions that develop while you're up in not exactly a tour, but however you want to make it up there.